Streaming services like Netflix are filled to the brim with programs that focus on when people break the rules and catching people who break the rules. It is no wonder that these shows dominate prime time in streaming television programming since shows like Narcos and Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, and NCIS bring in some of the highest viewer ratings and streaming rates. Today, true crime documentaries and podcasts about people who break the rules and often haven't been caught yet are incredibly popular. Also, local and national news programs often devote many segments of their broadcast to stories of people who have broken the rules, from a congressperson caught taking a bribe to a mugger who stabbed a man in downtown Chicago. Moreover, the plots of many classic movies like Silence of the Lambs, Taxi Driver, Scarface revolve around characters that break the rules. In short, by many indications, people are very interested, some might even say obsessed, with what social scientists call deviance. Deviance is defined as any behavior that violates the norms that apply in a given situation or social group. Norms are the rules and expectations of behavior in a given social group or situation. All social groups, large or small, have a set of rules and expectations for how individuals within the group should act. Some norms only apply to a very small group of people. For example, some families have the rule to not walk inside the house with shoes on. Some norms only apply to specific social groups. For example, there was a norm in the trailer park that I grew up in that people were to keep to themselves and to mind their own business. Finally, some norms apply to all people in a particular society. For example, it is the norm in the U.S. to wear clothing while in public, and the law, which is by definition a set of formal rules, defines many actions that people should not perform, such as murder, rape, theft, going over the speed limit. Because norms are relatively unique to each social group, what can be normative for one group can be deviant for another social group. Orthodox Jews aren't supposed to eat pork and cheeseburgers, but it's not an issue for many others in American society. People under 21 in the U.S. aren't supposed to drink alcohol, but people over 21 and over can. Norms can also vary from situation to situation. That is, some norms apply in certain situations, but not others. The norm to sit quietly applies in a college classroom, but not necessarily at a rock concert or a basketball game. Also, the same exact behavior can comply with norms in one situation, but violate norms in another situation. Crying and wailing at a funeral is expected normative behavior, but not so much at a birthday party or a wedding. Norms can be proscriptive or prescriptive. Proscriptive norms tell people what not to do, like don't talk on your phone during a movie, don't date your cousin, and don't kill. Prescriptive norms tell people what to do, like brush your teeth every morning, do give presents to loved ones during Christmas time, and do pay your taxes. There are four types of norms. The first are customs, which are expected behaviors that have little to no moral significance. People often think of those who don't follow customs as rude or weird, but not bad or evil. Examples of customs in the U.S. are saying excuse me after burping or sneezing, not chewing with one's mouth open, brushing one's teeth 2 times a day, and wearing deodorant. The second type of norm are mores, which are expected behaviors that have a moral significance. People often think of people who violate mores as doing bad or immoral things. Some examples of mores include the prohibition against stealing, the prohibition against using meth, and the prohibition against adultery. The third type of norm is taboos, which are expected behaviors that have extremely high levels of moral significance. You could think of taboos as mores on steroids. The breaking of taboos are often seen as unconscionable and unforgivable. Two big taboos in many societies are the taboos against incest or having sex with a relative, and polygamy, having more than one spouse. And the fourth type of norm are laws, which are expected behaviors that are enforced by the government or other societal authorities. These usually include most mores and usually all taboos. Governments do many things to enforce these norms, from fines to forced labor to imprisonment. Only behavior that violates laws is considered criminal behavior. This means that criminal behavior is just a subset of deviant behavior. There are many behaviors that are considered deviant by many but are not criminal, such as homosexual behavior or extramarital sex. Now, many people in everyday life think of deviant behavior in an absolutist sense, in that they believe that what is deviant for all social groups and for all situations. But this isn't the case. In fact, there is nothing inherent in any behavior that makes it deviant in all social groups and situations. For example, consider getting a tattoo. Members of many social groups have themselves tattooed, and thus having a tattoo is seen as normal to people in these social groups. Some social groups, however, view the tattoo in the skin as deviant according to their beliefs. In the United States, it used to be seen as quite deviant to get a tattoo. However, nowadays so many people have tattoos that having a tattoo is no longer seen as deviant. In fact, younger generations of Americans are starting to view tattoos on the face as normative, while people of my generation and older, even though they're in general okay with tattoos, think having a tattoo on your face is something you probably shouldn't do. Of course, one might say that tattoos are an easy example. What about a harder one, like the taking of another person's life? Surely this is something that is considered deviant in all social groups and situations. But on close inspection, this is not the case. In many social groups, the taking of another's life for revenge isn't seen as an egregious crime, and in many cases it is called for by the norms of these social groups. Also, many people don't see the taking of another person's life during wartime battle as deviant, nor do many people view the taking of another person's life in self-defense as deviant. Furthermore, governments throughout the centuries and today currently take people's lives away from them through executions, and many people don't see these actions as deviant. Even the current criminal justice system of the United States makes many distinctions between the crimes that involve taking another's life, from first, second, and third degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, vehicular manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, that show that the act of taking another person's life isn't always treated the same. So, if there isn't anything inherent in any behavior that makes it deviant, then how do particular behaviors become deviant ones? Well, it happens through the process of labeling. Labeling is when members of a social group define a particular behavior as belonging to a particular group of behaviors. And what happens is that a social group comes to some agreement that a certain set of behaviors will be considered deviant. Now, in regards to the process of labeling behavior as deviant, moral entrepreneurs play a crucial role. Moral entrepreneurs are the individuals and groups in a social group or a society who make it their mission to define some behavior as deviant and to enforce the punishing of this behavior when it occurs. There are two types of moral entrepreneurs: rule creators and rule enforcers. Rule creators are the individuals and groups that create the rules and norms broken by deviant behavior. Contemporary U.S. society has a number of individuals and groups whose main agenda is to define certain behaviors as deviant. For example, the psychiatric community is a group of rule creators. Through their criteria that they establish for mental illness, they label certain behaviors as deviant and in need of correction. Before contemporary psychiatry, children who were fidgety and didn't pay attention in school were just thought of as bored and uninterested in school. After the advent of contemporary psychiatry, these children are labeled as having attention deficit disorder and are given medications to correct their deviant behavior. Sometimes rule creators form groups in order to make certain behaviors deviant or to keep these behaviors deviant. For example, during the 1980s, groups such as Mothers Against Drunk Driving and Students Against Drunk Driving formed to make drunk driving laws much more stringent and punishing than they had been previously. Sometimes the rule creators have an incentive to make things deviant. For example, during the 1990s, several pundits and scientists attempted to define road rage as a dangerous social problem. Many of these pundits and scientists did this because they stood to gain financially from having road rage defined as a huge social problem, since governments and organizations paid these individuals for their testimonies and to give speeches on the topic. Also, before the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, vagrancy, or the wandering from place to place without permanent home or work, was not defined as illegal. However, after the Black Death killed about 1/3 of the European population, business owners, landowners, and governments made vagrancy against the law because they needed a source of cheap labor to replace all the cheap labor that had been killed during the bubonic plague. Religious leaders historically and currently have served as one of the main rule creators in social groups. For instance, the Bible consists of many prohibitions against certain behaviors, like adultery, stealing, homosexuality, divorce, some say the use of contraception, and Christian leaders often cite these prohibitions as reason why these behaviors are deviant. The success of rule creators often depends on the amount of power they have in a particular society. Historically and currently, religious leaders hold a lot of power in many social groups, which is one of the main reasons these individuals have been successful at labeling certain behaviors deviant. In the contemporary U.S., economic and social elites hold a lot of power, and they often are successful at labeling certain behaviors deviant. Part of this power comes from holding legislative and judicial offices where they can make laws that make certain behaviors criminal. The second type of moral entrepreneur is rule enforcers. Rule enforcers are individuals and groups that enforce rules and norms, often through sanctioning and punishment. The prime example of rule enforcers in contemporary society is, of course, the police. Rule enforcers don't make the rules, they just enforce them. Nevertheless, rule enforcers have a vested interest in the rules because enforcing these rules is how they make their living. Because of this, rule enforcers may not actually believe that certain behaviors are deviant, but they nevertheless enforce the sanctioning and punishing of these behaviors because that's what they have to do as part of their job. Individual and group rule creators often conflict with other individuals and groups who don't want to have a behavior labeled as deviant. We see this struggle all the time in contemporary society. Often these struggles occur because many individuals and groups have a vested interest in preventing certain behaviors from becoming deviant. For instance, a few years back, some psychiatrists and other so-called experts tried to get playing too many video games labeled as a psychiatric disorder, as a form of addiction. They were not successful, however, because other groups fought against this labeling, such as the video game industry and the insurance industry. Of course, the video game industry didn't want their product to be seen as a source of addiction like tobacco or heroin, and the insurance companies didn't want to have to pay for a treatment of this so-called addiction. Another case where rule creators and other groups and individuals have clashed is over whether or not there should be legalization of prostitution. The pro-legalization side of the debate and the anti-legalization side argue over the positive and negative effects of the legalization of prostitution for both individuals and society as a whole. Now, what is deviant and what isn't quite simply depends. Nevertheless, people are still interested in figuring out why people perform deviant behavior. And to understand this, we have to understand two things. First, we have to understand individuals' motives for committing deviant behavior. That is, we have to understand the factors that drive and compel people to perform deviant behavior. Most people who commit deviant behavior know that what they are doing is deviant and thus can be punished, but they do it anyway. What motivates people to perform certain types of behaviors that they very much know can bring about punishment from others? Why do people steal even though they know very well that if they get caught, there's a very high chance they will be punished? Why do people kill even though they know that they might be killed themselves if they are discovered? And the second thing we need to understand if we want to explain why people commit deviant behavior is the constraints on actually acting on the motives for committing deviant behavior. Even though somebody has an urge to do something deviant doesn't mean they'll actually act on that urge. A person might want to punch out a guy that spilled a drink on him in the bar, yet he doesn't do it. Another person might have the urge to crash her car into the guy who just cut her off in traffic, but she doesn't. A kid might have the urge to steal the latest Call of Duty game from the local GameStop, yet doesn't. You yourselves, watching this lecture now, have probably all had an urge to commit a deviant act at some point in your life, yet you did not go through with it. Why didn't you? What stops people from performing deviant behavior even though they want to commit the deviant behavior? We also have to understand this if we want to understand the committing of deviant behavior. Let's first start by discussing the motives for committing deviant behavior. Deviant behavior, like much other behavior, is a way to achieve a need or want. Almost all our behavior in life is to achieve a need or want. We get jobs so we can earn money to buy groceries, pay rent, keep up with our Netflix subscriptions. We get married so we can start families and find a partner to share experiences and expenses with. We try to get a college degree so we can have a good paying, self-fulfilling job. And just as we think of mundane, non-deviant behavior as motivated to fulfill needs and wants, we also need to think of deviant behavior in the same way. Deviant behavior is motivated by fulfilling needs and wants. A guy steals a bunch of cash from a payday loan store because he needs it to feed his family. A woman kills another woman because she saw her as a competitor for another's love. A kid tags some houses in a neighborhood so he can show his friends that he's cool, daring, and adventurous. In short, understanding the motivations behind deviant behavior means understanding the needs and wants people think they can fulfill by performing this deviant behavior. Some social psychologists argue that the need to lessen negative emotions provides the motivation for deviant behavior. That is, people perform deviant behavior because it is a way to cope or to deal with and or avoid negative emotions like anger and fear and sadness. According to this argument, there are three types of experiences that cause negative emotions, which in turn motivate deviant behavior. First, there is the failure to achieve goals in a conventional manner, or in a manner that is seen as normal, right, and just. When people feel that they cannot achieve a valued goal in a conventional manner, they will often turn to deviant behavior to achieve said goal. For example, if a person thinks he can't get rich by working hard at a normal everyday job, he might turn to organized crime or the drug trade. People who turn to deviant behavior to achieve a valued goal often do so because they do not have access to the means to achieve the valued goals in a conventional manner. A person wants to get rich but can't afford to go to college, so she might start smuggling drugs. This is why new immigrant groups and racial and ethnic minorities in the U.S. often turn to organized crime. Many people who belong to ethnic groups that immigrated to America in large numbers, like the Italians, the Irish, and Jews in the 19th century, the Jamaicans, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans in the 20th century, often participated in organized crime, drug dealing, running gambling rings and numbers, pimping prostitutes, loan sharking, you name it. The same could be said for many people who belong to social groups that are discriminated against in America, such as African Americans and Hispanics. Now, while there were theories bandied about that these people were simply more prone to commit crime, which of course is entirely unfounded, the fact of the matter is that most people participate in organized crime for one reason: to make money. Organized crime is like a business, a non-legitimate business, but a business nonetheless. Social psychologists argue that members of these disadvantaged groups often turn to organized crime because they wanted to achieve the goals of wealth and status, but because they did not have access to the means to achieve these goals because of discrimination against them, they innovated and turned to organized crime to achieve these goals. An Irish person couldn't get a respectable job in the 19th century New York because of discrimination against the Irish. So many of these Irish turned to organized crime to make money. The second type of experience that causes negative emotions, which in turn motivates deviant behavior, is the removal of positive stimuli. When people lose access to objects that cause them to feel positive emotions, they often turn to deviant behavior to gain access to these objects once more. For example, say that a kid really gets a lot of pleasure from playing his Xbox, and saying that it all of a sudden just stops working one day. The red light of death, as they say. He's got no money to get it fixed or to get another one, and thus he might try to steal some cash from his parents so he could get another one. The third type of experience that causes negative emotions, which in turn motivates deviant behavior, is confrontation with negative stimuli. Negative stimuli causes individuals to experience negative emotions, and thus sometimes people turn to deviant behavior to avoid confrontations with negative stimuli. An example of being confronted with negative stimuli is when a kid goes to school and constantly receives low grades on his exams and assignments. He might start avoiding this, school altogether by being truant and eventually dropping out, so he just avoids this negative stimuli. Also, people often turn to deviant behavior to deal with negative emotions caused by confrontation with negative stimuli. Avoiding negative stimuli all the time is impossible, of course, and sometimes people deal with the negative emotions caused by the exposure to negative stimuli by committing deviant behavior. For example, a person who's been berated by his boss earlier in the day might try to let out the anger he felt toward his boss by punching out a guy during happy hour at Applebee's. Another perspective on the motives for committing deviant behavior comes from evolutionary social psychologists. Evolutionary social psychologists argue that we are born with psychological adaptations that make us predisposed to commit what is now considered deviant behavior. Evolutionary social psychologists argue that certain behaviors gave our ancestors a survival and reproductive advantage, and thus we have inherited tendencies to act in particular ways. However, some of the behaviors that we have tendencies to do are at odds with the prevailing morality of contemporary societies, and thus are now considered deviant. As we've talked about before, our notions of right and wrong, of morality, change much quicker than our genetics do. Let's review some examples of evolutionary social psychological explanations for what we now consider deviant behavior. Let's first talk about why some men are prone, at least according to evolutionary social psychologists, to commit rape. According to evolutionary social psychologists, early human males were either cads or dads. Cads were early human males who raped as many females as possible and did not contribute resources to raising offspring. On the other hand, dads were early human males who formed lasting sexual relationships and contributed resources to raising offspring. Both cads and dads were able to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation, although in very different ways. Cads raped and impregnated a lot of women, and dads formed lasting sexual relationships with their mothers of the children. Because both cads and dads were able to pass on their genes to the next generation, there are men today who are descendants of cads and who are descendants of dads. Because of this, there are men in the human population who are more prone to commit rape than other men because they are descended from more cads than they are dads. Evolutionary social psychologists argue that evolved psychological adaptations help explain the motive to murder family members, in particular children. For example, one of the biggest predictors of being a victim of child abuse or being murdered as a child is being a stepchild. You can see from this chart, this is the murder rates of child victims and by whether they are step or genetic children. And no, I have not left off rates for genetic children. They are just so low in comparison to murder rates for stepchildren that they become almost negligible. It's not even close. Evolutionary social psychologists argue that this pattern exists because humans have evolved psychological adaptations that prevent them from abusing their genetic children. And this makes sense since early humans who would have abused their children were more likely to have killed their children and thus would not have passed on their genes to the next generation. However, these evolved psychological adaptations, while preventing the abuse of genetic children, don't really kick in, so to speak, for non-genetic children. Because of this, children who reside with step-parents are more likely to be victims of child abuse and murder than children who reside with both genetic parents or just a single genetic parent. Another motive for committing deviant behavior that evolutionary social psychologists have tried to explain is the motive that husbands and boyfriends have for killing their wives and girlfriends when they threaten to end the relationship. This is especially the case for younger women. Evolutionary social psychologists argue that this pattern is a result of the evolved psychological adaptation to be sexually jealous. Early human males that were sexually jealous were more likely to pass on their genes to the next generation, since they would have prevented their mates from having sex with other men. A downside of this, however, is that human males now respond to sexual jealousy with violent behavior. This is especially the case when women are young because they still have much potential fertility, and thus sexual jealousy is even stronger. Sometimes the motive for committing deviant behavior is because of the groups in which people belong. Sometimes people belong to groups that teach and expect behavior that others consider deviant. That is, the behavior is normative for the group in which one belongs, but the behavior is considered deviant to other groups. In these cases, the motivation for committing deviant behavior is basically to conform to the group, which is a very powerful motivation, as you'll learn about later in the semester. There are many groups in our society that follow norms that are contrary to the norms followed to and adhered by other groups in a society. Although following these norms is not deviant within the context of a particular group, it is considered deviant in relation to other groups. For instance, some Mormon fringe groups, but not most members of the main church, still practice polygyny, which is when one man marries several women. Although polygyny is not considered deviant by members of these fringe groups, it is considered deviant by most other Americans who believe that only two people should be allowed to enter into a marital agreement. When people are raised in and associate with deviant groups, they learn how to commit deviant actions. For example, people who belong to groups that smoke marijuana learn how to enjoy the effects of marijuana from their fellow group members, as well as how to obtain this illegal substance and how to ingest it. That is, when a person starts hanging out with other pot smokers, she learns from others how to roll a joint or light a bong, the ritual of passing to the left, and that she should interpret the physical symptoms she feels after smoking pot as pleasurable and not a cause of concern. Another example. When a person starts selling illegal drugs, he learns from fellow drug dealers about how to actually go about selling drugs. He learns from his fellow dealers where to hide the drugs so no one steals them. He learns how to avoid getting caught by the cops. He learns how to launder the money he makes from selling drugs, and all the various other tasks needed to be a successful drug dealer. Another thing that people learn when they are raised in and associate with deviant groups are techniques of neutralization. Techniques of neutralization are the justifications and rationalizations deviant groups offer for committing deviant acts. Members of deviant groups often have to defend their deviant actions to non-members, and they often cite these techniques of neutralization. For example, some of the techniques of neutralization that pot smokers use are that it's good for one's health and that they aren't hurting anybody when they smoke up. And there are 5 types of techniques of neutralization. The first technique of neutralization is denial of responsibility. This is when people who've committed deviant actions argue that they haven't actually done anything. An example of this is when a pot smoker denies that he's actually even smoked pot. A second technique of neutralization is denial of injury. This is when people who commit deviant actions argue their actions aren't really deviant because they didn't hurt anybody. Pot smokers who argue that their habit doesn't hurt anybody is a good example of this type of technique. The third technique of neutralization is denial of the victim. This is when people argue that the victims of their deviant actions deserve what they got. An example of this is when a Southerner shoots another man for insulting him, then argues that the man had it coming. The fourth technique of neutralization is condemnation of condemners. This is when people argue that those who are condemning their deviant actions are just as bad, if not more so, than themselves. Street criminals who argue that business people perform crimes that are much more egregious than the ones they perform is an example of this technique. The fifth technique of neutralization is appeal to higher loyalties. This is when people argue that their deviant actions are for a greater good, so to speak, or due to their loyalty to their fellow group members. Terrorists often use this type of technique, arguing that their acts of violence against governments and civilians is all to achieve a greater good. Now, according to some social psychologists, these techniques of neutralization allow members of deviant groups to continue committing deviant acts. Because members of deviant groups are exposed to dominant norms through the mass media and institutions such as schools and churches, they sometimes experience guilt and other negative emotions when they commit deviant behavior. These techniques allow members of these subcultures to justify to themselves their deviant behavior, which in turn lessens their feelings of guilt and other negative emotions for participating in the deviant behavior. Now, as I said previously, just because somebody has a motive for committing deviant behavior doesn't necessarily mean that they'll commit the deviant behavior. Not everybody who wants to steal something actually does so. Not everyone who wants to punch somebody in the mouth for saying something smart actually does. Not everyone who would like to cheat on their spouse actually does. Why not? Well, because there are various constraints on committing deviant behavior. So let's now review these constraints. Whether people perform deviant behavior is whether they perceive opportunities to do so. When people believe that they can successfully carry out their deviant behavior, they are more likely to do so. However, when people don't believe they can carry out successfully their deviant behavior, they are less likely to do so. For example, one guy may want to steal a woman's purse, but he doesn't do it because he thinks he won't get away with it for whatever reason. There are 2 big factors that influence people's perceptions of whether they will be successful in committing deviant behavior. The first is the identification and presence of suitable targets. If you want to rob somebody, you're going to be out of luck if there isn't anybody around you think has any cash to rob. The second is the absence of others to prevent the performance of deviant behavior. If you want to rob somebody but there are cops around, then you'll probably think twice before going through with it. The perception of perceived opportunities to commit deviant behavior is the main idea behind what's called broken windows theory. According to this theory, people view environments that are physically deteriorated and have signs of previous and current deviant behavior as a sign that local residents and authorities are apathetic. That is, when people are in neighborhoods with lots of broken windows, shuttered buildings, and graffiti, and with lots of open-air drug dealers, prostitutes, and public urinators around, people will interpret this as a sign that residents of these neighborhoods are apathetic and don't care about what goes on in their neighborhood. This perception frees up people, so to speak, to commit other deviant acts because they come to the belief that no one in the neighborhood will try to stop them by intervening themselves or by calling the police. Broken windows theory is based on a social psychological experiment done in 1969. In this experiment, the researcher parked two cars without license plates in the Bronx of New York City and Palo Alto, California, the city where Stanford University is. Within 10 minutes, the car in the Bronx was attacked by vandals. However, the car in Palo Alto had not been touched. The experimenter then went and smashed the Palo Alto car with a sledgehammer and left. After a few hours, the car in Palo Alto had been turned over and destroyed. Social psychologists who developed broken windows theory reasoned from this experiment that perceived neighborhood apathy, as seen by the presence of unmarked and broken down cars, leads people to commit deviant behavior. Some social psychologists argue that another constraint on acting on deviant motives is anticipated rewards and costs. People often will act on deviant motives when they anticipate much rewards and little cost for committing the deviant behavior. However, people often will not act on deviant motives when they anticipate little to no rewards and high costs for committing the behavior. In other words, when people are trying to decide whether or not to commit deviant behavior, they often weigh the anticipated rewards and costs with one another. If the costs outweigh the rewards, they often will not act on these motives. However, if the rewards outweigh the costs, they will act on these motives. The idea that a constraint on committing deviant behavior is anticipated rewards and costs is the basis of deterrence theory. Deterrence theory is the social policy idea that increasing rewards for non-deviant behavior and increasing costs for deviant behavior will discourage such behavior. And deterrence theory is the basis behind much crime policy in the U.S. today, especially crime policy against drug-related crimes such as drug use, possession, selling, and distribution. The war on drugs, as it has been called, dramatically increased the cost of drug use, possession, production, selling, and distribution in the hopes that these increased costs in terms of jail time and prison time and fines would deter people from performing these activities. Some social psychologists argue that social bonds are the reason why people decide not to perform deviant behavior. That is, the relationships people have with others and their want to maintain these relationships often prevents them from acting on deviant motives. According to this explanation, social bonds are made up of four elements. The first is attachment, which is defined as having close emotional ties to conventional others, such as parents, teachers, and coaches, and caring about meeting their expectations. When a person has many close emotional ties with conventional others, she will tend not to perform deviant behavior because she does not want to risk losing these ties. A person who may want to cheat on his wife, for example, might not even do so, even if he has the opportunity, because he doesn't want to risk the relationship he has with his wife, his children, his in-laws, his pastor, and his friends if he were caught. The second element of social bonds is commitment, which refers to the investment a person has made into conventional long-term goals. When a person has her eyes set on conventional long-term goals, such as getting a college degree or starting a business, she is less likely to commit deviant behavior because such deviant behavior may be detrimental to achieving these goals. For instance, a person who wants to go to law school in the future avoids breaking the law, including getting traffic tickets, so that she can get accepted to a good law school. Yes, if you want to go to law school, you often have to report all the crimes in which you've been convicted or pled guilty, including any automobile violations. They do this because they don't like to let anyone in who doesn't show respect for the law through his or her behavior. Third element of social bonds is involvement, which is the amount of time spent in conventional, non-deviant activities. When a person spends much time in conventional, non-deviant activities, they don't have a lot of free time to spend performing deviant behavior. In other words, keeping busy with school, work, and extracurricular activities keeps people out of trouble. Finally, the fourth element of social bonds is belief, or personal acceptance of conventional morals and values. When a person has personally accepted conventional morals and values, he doesn't perform deviant behavior because he personally feels that this behavior is fundamentally wrong. Social psychologists have found support for the idea that social bonds stop people from acting on deviant motives. For instance, they found that male juvenile delinquents who form strong attachments with other people, such as girlfriends and spouses, and other institutions, such as the church, and participate in conventional activities of working for wage, were less likely to commit crime later in life than juvenile delinquents that did not form these attachments or participate in these conventional activities. Another constraint on acting on deviant motives, according to some social psychologists, is self control. These social psychologists argue that people with much self control don't engage much in short term pleasure seeking behavior, which often translates into deviant behavior, and don't act on deviant motives because they can think about the negative consequences they will experience if they were to act on these deviant motives. This is not the case, though, for people with low self control. For instance, someone with much self control who wants a new iPad would save up his money that he makes on his job to buy one, but someone with little self control might just go and steal one. Also, the person with much self control will consider the negative consequences for himself for stealing an iPad. The person with little self control would not consider these negative consequences. Now, even if self control is an important constraint on acting on deviant motives, what remains to be explained is where does self control or lack thereof come from? Some social psychologists argue that some people have low self control because of improper socialization. These social psychologists argue that no or inconsistent punishment, lack of moral instruction, and bad modeling causes kids to grow up as adults with little self control. And there is some support for this idea. Several social psychologists have shown that children who grew up in abusive homes or homes where their parents interact with them very much are likely to be deviant as adults. Another explanation given for why some people develop little or no self control is neurotoxicity, which is when chemical imbalances and environmental toxins cause disruptions in normal brain development and functioning. Studies do show that heavy metals such as lead, mercury, and cadmium are very toxic in very tiny doses and can have a big influence on brain functioning. Also, studies have shown that low blood sugar and vitamin deficiencies also can cause erratic behavior, which often translates into deviant behavior. Okay, well, that is the lecture for deviance. Uh, so, see you for the next set of slides. Bye bye.